Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today I have a special episode for you guys as I want to give you my thoughts on how to ideally build an NFL roster. Now, this is not gospel, this is not necessarily a perfect discussion, right? I'm just a 23-year-old guy who's really got into this stuff over a few years, and I want to give you guys my thoughts on it, my observations, what I've learned. And there are a lot of lessons that I have learned in the past few years, a lot of things that I've been wrong on. And I see when I watch Jacksonville and the way they construct their roster, a lot of mistakes in the decisions they make, and I'm sure we all do. So I want to give you guys some thoughts on how I would construct it, what my goals would be, and a little bit of like how you could apply that to this off season, maybe some of the decisions you make. In addition, I'm hoping to sometime here soon, might be after Senior Bowl stuff next week, to put out a video on lessons learned from 2023. I think that would be something fun to do each year because there's something we learn every year. For example, I predicted the Jaguars to win the Super Bowl this year. They didn't even make the playoffs. So there's things I learn every year, and we get blinded by stuff, and so I think that would be a fun video to kind of note all those things and to see like what you guys also learned and kind of further our knowledge on this stuff, so we really know what we're talking about even better, because that's the goal of this channel. It's to inform, and it's for people to be able to bring up really any opinions, and for us to ultimately make our own choices on what we think, and be informed and make good decisions in doing such. So with that all said, we're going to jump into this. So I want to give you an ideal scenario for what an NFL team should look like, and I will compare it to an organization in the NFL. So what you ultimately want is, entering the offseason, you want to have little to no need for free agents, first of all. You do not want to be a team that has to look at free agency and say, we have a need here, we have a need here, we got to do this, we got to do that, and there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm not sure we can do that. You want to be a team that goes in, has a talented roster, has a ton of players in-house that they've developed. You want to be a team that's, if they're having debates talking about having a guy maybe continue their career there, or someone in-house perhaps being able to take over. I think an example of this, in terms of just consistently good general drafting and roster building, would be the San Francisco 49ers. And there's an exception to that, right? Everyone's going to jump right on it. Trey Lance. That is the big problem with them, and why they haven't made a Super Bowl is because they never really figured out quarterback. And obviously, they have Brock Purdy now, and Purdy's fine, and there's all kinds of debate around him, but Purdy is not, some top 10 quarterback in the NFL right now. He may prove that. Maybe he wins the Super Bowl in a couple weeks, and that becomes a thing, and I'm sure it already is at this point. But that's the thing the 49ers have struggled with, and why they haven't made a Super Bowl. But you look at the rest of that roster, you look at the offense, especially, you can look at it and say there's a reason why Brock Purdy is able to come in and have success, because the system around him is so well designed, and there's so many players that fit into it and perform at a high level, whether they're recognized or not. And so that's kind of what you want to achieve in the NFL. Obviously, minus the quarterback side of it, because you don't want to go trade 3 first-rounders for a guy that you end up getting rid of before his third year in the NFL, which still is crazy to me that they did that. No matter how bad you think he was in training camp or preseason, I just don't know how that was even an option. But that's a whole nother topic. So it's crazy to think, too, like with the 49ers, that they've built this team without 3 of their first rounders and throwing what they got out of that away on a quarterback they got rid of. But they consistently draft well. And so when you make mistakes, there's a plan in-house for it. There's things that they can do to mitigate that don't involve having to go out and spend $20 million on a guy. So, talking about the Jaguars and how they go into this, how I kind of see them right now. This is a team that, starting in 2022, let's start there. This was a generally bad roster at that point. Now, there were players on that roster who really changed the perspectives on themselves. Some we expected, some we didn't completely. So, like Andre Sisco went from being a backup to a really good starter. Trevor Lawrence went from terrible first season, because of Urban Meyer, to all of a sudden now this guy's like maybe a top 5 quarterback in the NFL just over the course of 2022. But there were questions on the roster and things that needed to be done. It wasn't a good team at that point going into the offseason. So Jacksonville was forced to spend in 2022, and they did such. They broke records for it. I think it was the most money ever spent in an offseason. And that was a choice they had to make. And I personally supported the idea, and I still understand it now, because, maybe if you didn't have the quarterback, I wouldn't support it. But you've got to build a team to where they can compete, to where you have something around him and you can see if he's the guy. So there was very much an argument for that. And there was the opportunity for the Jaguars to supplement that and be able to move on from it by drafting well, by having replacements in-house. And ultimately, in some aspects, they've done that. In some aspects, they failed at it. In many aspects, actually. I'll correct that. They failed in it a lot more than they've succeeded. I'll give you an example of a miss. One that everyone sees from last year. You could have done this by, for example, with Brandon Scherff, you brought him in, paid him a lot of money, right? And as far as how he's performed, not really good enough for that amount of money. He's been okay, but that's a player that is just so expensive that's not an ideal situation for the team. Last year, one of the guys I really liked and a lot of people liked for Jacksonville was O'Cyrus Torrence, to the point where he was considered, at 24 for this team. Not only was he available then at 26 and 27, he was available at 56 for the Jaguars. And they made the decision to pass on him. Seemingly no reason why other than, I think, a failure of scouting in the organization. But you don't accomplish this ultimate goal of drafting and developing properly because you don't have the guy there to replace him. Unless you want to make the argument for Cooper Hodges, who hasn't taken an NFL snap during the regular season. So that's a massive projection. So that's where you get the issue, where Jacksonville, what it needed to do to supplement the way they were building the roster wasn't done. And so we're in a spot where this team just is not in an ideal situation in any way. There's a lot of expensive contracts. There's ones that you don't feel like you can move off of because you already have a ton of needs. The roster has not been good enough still, despite having some blue chip players here finally. There's still holes. And there's a question of how many holes can you open up while still staying a contender this next season. And you get that with guys like Brandon Scherff, like Cam Robinson, all these kinds of guys. So Jacksonville's failed at this approach. And I think looking at the way the roster is and me trying to figure out how I would rebuild it, because I've done a lot of different builds this offseason just looking at it in my spare time. I do not think there is a build out there that can make the Jaguars a legitimate, top tier Super Bowl contender this year. The only way that's possible, I think, is if every single player outperforms their expectations. And that's not realistic to expect in any way, shape, or form. I think it's a 2-year rebuild for this team. I think the earliest that they will be a deep playoff contender in an ideal scenario is probably in the 2025 season. 2 off seasons of rebuilding. And, for me, I look at how to build a team. One of the things they've done that just really is not an option is paying out expensive contracts for underperforming players. Examples, there's plenty of them. Brandon Scherf, already mentioned him. But this is a player who's getting older. He used to be really good. He's not as good now, yet he's being paid like it. He's being paid one of the biggest contracts at guard in the entire NFL. I think Cam Robinson, where his number is right now, is an issue. He is being overpaid for what he's done. And I understand why they paid him that. And I know that there's injury problems that add into this. But it is still a mistake. I think a really obvious example of this too is Rayshawn Jenkins. And I think last year that he was kept in Jacksonville solely because of the big moments. And those were incredibly important to this team. I'm not saying they weren't. And you can easily say that this team wouldn't have made the playoffs in 2022 without Rayshawn Jenkins because he had the game-winning pick against Dallas, and more importantly, he had what was essentially the game-winning forced fumble on Josh Dobbs in Week 18 against Tennessee. So you can make that argument, but it's not about what Rayshawn Jenkins has done in 2022. It's about what is he going to do in 2023. And now what is he going to do in 2024? And the reality is, for him as a player, he may do some of the extra things pretty well, but he's not good in coverage. And you're paying him $10 million. I know for a fact, if Rayshawn Jenkins hit the market and you told him, hey, we'll match whatever offer you get out there, it ain't going to be $10 million. It's going to be a heck of a lot less. So you have to ask yourself, why are we paying him? And that's a big issue with the way this roster is constructed. When you're pursuing free agents, this is my next point here. And just talking about how I would handle free agency in general. You need to pursue players that are either second contract guys, they're an ideal fit in your scheme, arguably and hopefully better than where they were, and guys that you feel like are clear and likely to outperform the contracts you hand them. I will give you two examples of this that Jacksonville has done. Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram. And Evan, yeah, you signed him 1 year, and then you extended him after he proved it. He still outperformed what he was last year this season. But Christian Kirk, he was a player who fit better into this team. He needed to get away from DeAndre Hopkins to where he was the number one for a year. I think that built a lot of confidence with him. He's used very well. He has become an entirely different player here, to the point where we really went from Christian Kirk's the most overpaid receiver in the NFL to, quite frankly, like, I'd be fine paying him 21, 22 million a year, because that is his value. You saw his value at the end of this year when the team fell off a cliff when he was off the field. And there were other things that factor into that too, but that is a huge part of that, a massive part of it. So he's a guy who fits that narrative. Those are the kind of guys you hit on. And that's why Jacksonville took the big leap from being worst in the NFL to being the first team who was worst in the NFL and win a playoff game the next year. Evan Ingram. He was a guy who was pretty much laughed at going into free agency because he had so many drop issues in New York. Yet he comes into Jacksonville. He outperforms. You could see it pretty early in the year when, even though his numbers weren't large, you saw every time he got the ball that he would force a first down. He would fight to the death with defenders. Like, he was a great football player for them when he got the ball. And they've given it to him more and more, especially the second year, to where he almost broke the receptions record, and he's outperforming his contract. Those are the players that you pursue. And so that should be the focus for what this team does. The other focus that you can have is going after veterans who are consistent, who've played well, but they're undervalued, and getting them on short-term deals where you only have 1 year of guarantees. So, for example, Leonard Floyd might not be like a super old player, but he started to get short deals here recently. He got one from Buffalo for about $6 million. And he went out to Buffalo. I think he got like 9 sacks this year, which, if you didn't know, that's pretty freaking good for $6 million a year being your pay. Yet he's probably going to get signed for pretty cheap this offseason. Justin Houston, all the way up until when he played for Carolina, which almost no one was going to succeed in that situation, he was a guy who was getting near double-digit sacks every single season, despite being a rotational pass rusher. And you know how much he was paid? $5 million a year. But the reason why that continued to happen is because he's an older player. When is he going to fall off? When's that going to happen? You can take risks on those players because you have already taken care of what much of the risk represents by paying them less. Because it's not much to lose, but you have so much to gain from those contracts. So those are players I look at too. I think would be really important to bring into Jacksonville. The other thing about free agency and generally building the roster, and what we don't really talk about a ton as fans when we're doing like our little rebuilds and discussing what we would do, it's not you do the draft and then you look at free agency. A lot of free agents go, some of them stay after free agency, but it's not the top ones most of the time. You go to the free agent market, you fill your biggest needs, you fill the ones you can't survive without filling. In the draft, you go for talent over the needs on your team, because you shouldn't have needs that are so important that you have to draft the position. So it's free agency and then the draft. And so you have to look at your roster and address those needs whenever, middle of March comes around and free agency begins. That has to happen so that you can go into the draft, you draft the best players every year, and that's how you have a talented roster that is going to have solutions present themselves every year, especially when you draft well in the later rounds. Now, that's a big issue here because last year, and he didn't even care to discuss it as press conference, which was pretty sad because I think he should have. I think he should have explained himself. Last year, Trent Baalke said, well, day 3's for special teamers. Stupid idea. Absolutely stupid idea. I'm not saying that they can't contribute on special teams, but you are not looking for players based on their special teams value. Day 3, you're still looking for potential starters. You're understanding that it is not necessarily a likely thing that they're going to be hits, but you have to go after those players because that is how you launch your team forward. That's how you get steals. That's how you essentially get the value of another first-round pick out of nothing. Because think about the Rams with Puka Nacua. They picked him in the 4th or 5th round, yet if we did a redraft today, he might be a top 10 pick. He should be a top 10 pick because he was like a 1,500-yard receiver. Did the Rams have to pay a top 10 pick? No, paid a 4th or 5th. Antonio Johnson is our one example of a player like that over the last few years that I can recall currently. Antonio was drafted at 160th overall, and while he didn't play a ton this year, when he was on the field, he made impact plays. And if you watched his film in college, you watched the way he played, he was the second best nickel cornerback from this last year. And I think ultimately he should move to strong safety. And because they hit on that late in the draft, now you have an example on this team, hopefully that takes place in the offseason, of how you can implement this approach. Because you've got Rayshon Jenkins making a lot of money that he doesn't need to be making, quite frankly. Because you have a guy behind him who's arguably better. I think he is better, but I'll just say arguably because he hasn't played a ton of snaps yet. And he is like $1 million a year, whereas Rayshon's like 8 or 9. It's an obvious choice. So now you save money, and you have that money to go extend your other players. And if you absolutely have to use it in free agency to supplement the roster. I understand last year why the team didn't spend in free agency. I get that. I do not get why they lied to themselves and said that there were no needs on this team. Because there were clear ones that weren't addressed, they weren't talked about, and we got to the draft, and some of them were hit, and a lot of them weren't. And so I think like that approach of not spending a ton last year was fine, but they had to hit a few positions, and they failed to, and it led to a lot of issues this year because they weren't honest with themselves. This year for me, I think there's going to be probably at least 4 positions they have to address in free agency. I think one is receiver. I think you need a replacement for Zay Jones. Whether or not that guy ends up starting, and what I mean by that is it's potentially possible you draft a receiver who can start. But you need a guy who can start on this team and can perform well for the Jaguars at receiver. Ideally a vertical threat. You need at least one offensive lineman. I think specifically a center. Because a right guard, even if you let Brandon Scherf walk, which I think you should, you have guys on the team you feel like you could make play that if you absolutely have to, and you might be okay. You should be okay, but it's not ideal, right? Like you could have Walker a little transition for an offseason. Cooper Hodges might be able to take over. It is not ideal. You hope to draft that, maybe even trade for it after the draft. But that's one I think that's just under a major need, the way I would define those terms. On the defensive side of the ball, I think you need at least one pass rusher, for sure. I think you need someone who plays on the defensive line, ideally with the versatility to play most of anywhere. If you bring that in, then I think that frees up needs a little bit. I'd still like to do more, but that's hitting a major need. And the final one is potentially cornerback. Now, it depends on what happens with Darius Williams, but regardless, you're going to need a slot, and I think you need to at least bring in one guy. So those are my general thoughts on how I would do it. And I'll give you kind of a mock of what this would look like. I'll walk you through it real quick. I don't have a draft with this. This is mainly talking about free agency. I will probably do a video as well in the future again on how I would rebuild the Jaguars this offseason. It will be very similar to the one I did right after the season, but I want to do it with some more perspective, more time to think, and just generally knowing more and give you guys something better, I think. I think we can do that. So, especially with Ryan Nielsen, by the way. He was not hired when I made the original video. So we'll take a look at what I've done here. So I'll explain all this. This is a lot of mumbo jumbo here. Your current guys who are under contract. I do not have anyone restructured in this scenario. I hope, ideally, you don't have to restructure anyone. I have ultimately 4 guys getting cut, 1 getting traded, 1 getting reworked on their current deal. So first one be Brandon Scherf. I would cut him at this point. I think even if you felt like he should be a starter, you want him on your team, you just see what someone else would pay him, and you pay him that. If you have to do that, that is an option. But he's someone I would move on from because you need to plan for the future. His contract is not one of those contracts I mentioned where you're getting a second contract guy who has upside, who can outperform, or a seasoned veteran on a short contract. This was a long-term contract. It was 3 years. That is not ideal. So I would move on from it because I do not see any way you're getting your bang for your buck at the price he's at right now unless he plays out of his mind this next season. And there are absolutely no signs pointing to that. Now, I'll go back to Cam here in a second. You'll see the numbers are different. But we'll go through the releases. Full runs Ufadakasi. I have him getting cut. $8 million a year, and you can't tell if he's on the field or not. It's pretty simple. You can do better, you free up the snaps, and you try to go find someone else who can replace him. And quite frankly, like, worst case scenario, what Angelo Blackson did, just a random guy you basically picked off the streets here over the last couple of years, was identical to what Fadakasi was offering to the team. Not much of a difference. And you pay that guy close to bare minimum. So why keep a player that is barely better at best, but 8 times as expensive? There's no argument. Rayshawn Jenkins. This would be our example of implementing this approach of, hey, we got the guy in the draft to replace him. It was even better because we got him late. That's Antonio Johnson. We have 3 years of him on a rookie deal still. We're going to have him start because that's how we get the most out of that pick. That's how we save money. That's how we're able to go do something else. So Rayshawn Jenkins, obvious player to cut because not only all those things I mentioned, but he's in no way, shape, or form living up to his contract currently. So I would cut him. And then Zay Jones I would cut because ultimately I think his ceiling on this team is worth what he's getting paid by the team. And that's not good enough. You should not take deals where the best case scenario is you get exactly your bang for your buck. Not good enough. Now, I would also consider Beathard. Might be a guy you move on from. I don't know who would replace him. But I would consider competition just a little bit behind Lawrence. Not that someone's going to take his job from him. But I think it's important they don't stay complacent there because they very much have. Darius Williams. This is one I don't know what's going to happen with. But I will tell you this right now about Darius Williams. As much as I love him as a player, I love him as a person, I love what he does for Jacksonville. The scheme that Ryan Nielsen is bringing in, no matter what Trent Baalke says, ideally runs a lot of man coverage, especially press man. Can Williams do that? Sure. Is that what he's great at? No, not at all. There's a very big difference in what he does in zone coverage versus press man. And that's part of the reason why Jacksonville ran so much zone this last year. Darius Williams is, I think at this point, probably a top 5 zone cornerback. He has a tremendous amount of value to teams that run zone coverage. He is also a player, as you can see here, who comes with a $500,000 cap hit if you release him or you trade him. You save $11 million. That's a lot of money. That's money you can go find in their cornerback with that does man coverage, that may fit the scheme better. And not only that, but I think because Darius Williams took a cheap deal to come here, and I commend him for that. And I will not be one bit angry if he stays here, and I will support it because I think it would be great, but I don't expect it at this point. I think Darius Williams is a good enough player on a great deal that he will absolutely garner trade interest. Keep in mind, this team was able to trade A.J. Boye after 2018, 2019. I don't remember if it was 2019 or which year, but he'd fallen off a bit. Still had some trade value. Darius Williams is a much better player. You can't tell me that a team like San Francisco that's about even on the cap right now, that runs zone coverage, that needs a cornerback, that regardless of whether they win the Super Bowl or get knocked out or whatever, they're going to be aggressive. You can't tell me that that team would not be interested in a player like this and pay something valuable for him. Because that is an asset to have. Darius Williams, based off that, and the idea that he is 31 now, this is around the point where a player starts to regress in the NFL. I think you could absolutely see him be a player that has some value, and this be a good point to move on from him. So that might be a controversial one. I personally am not huge on either side, but I see a very good argument for both sides, and this is the one that I think would be best long-term for Jacksonville. Because I think you could go get a third-round compensatory pick that a team got from last year. 49ers might send 98 for him. I don't think that's crazy to say. So I would do that. And the final one of the guys who were under contract, Cam Robinson. I think with Cam that he's a player you want here, but you don't want him here at the number that he's at now. He's been injured, and as a run blocker, it hasn't been as good as you want. So I would keep it like this. I'd simply tell him, look, we want to keep you around, but we can't do this cap number. We want to give you a 1-year prove-it deal. You'll still be paid relatively well, but it's going to be significantly less where you are. So, for example, maybe $10 million. And if he doesn't want to accept that, then you tell him, okay, we're going to release you. We're going to cut you. If you get a contract offer in free agency, we know you want to be here. We will match that offer, up to a certain point. Because I don't see another team in the NFL going out and offering him more than that. I don't think that's reasonable, quite frankly. And that's how you get a player to go down on what you're paying him. And that will inspire him. I mean, I know he won't be happy, right? But that gives him a reason to perform very well this next year. Because it will be a contract year and he has something to prove and he has something to earn. Maybe you put incentives in his contract. There are things you can do. And so I think you can lessen this cap hit quite a dang bit. I think you can get it down $8 million from where it is. So that's 100% a move I'm considering doing with Cam Robinson because I think you want to keep him around. I don't think you want to have to draft a tackle again early in the draft. And you need to focus on some other things for this team as well. So Cam Robinson, that's what I would do. Now I'll kind of run through the rest of this. Guys I brought back, there's some simple ones. Gregory Jr., Daniel Thomas, Tim Jones, Dearness Johnson. Simple, cheap contracts. I gave Daniel Thomas. Oh my gosh, I would not pay Daniel Jones. So I gave Daniel Thomas just under $2 million a year because, he doesn't start a ton, but you can have spots for special teamers. Not that you're trying to draft for him, but Daniel Thomas is a very good special teamer. You can pay him. It's similar to Wingard. I'm just not putting him at that high of a number because Wingard plays more at that same position, and I think he has more importance as a leader on this team as well. And then the rest of them, here are pretty much bare minimum deals for the most part. Now, Josh Allen and Calvin Ridley, very simple to me, right? Josh Allen, you have to extend him before the franchise tag deadline. Whatever it is, you do it. Unless he's telling you I want $40 million a year. He's crazy if he says that because he's not getting it. And there's no way he's asking for that. I'm sure whatever number it is, you can get it done. And you have to get it done. Because you set this team back, I think at least 1 year, bare minimum, not bringing him back, even with the extra draft picks you would get. So you get your deal done. He wants to be here. It's simple. I cannot understand for the life of me how they have not even started negotiations. It's a whole nother thing. But we're talking about what I would do. That frees up your franchise tag, and you're using it on Calvin Ridley. Even if you wanted to get rid of Calvin Ridley and you said, oh, I want to trade for T. Higgins, or I want to sign Mike Evans, or whatever it may be. Everyone's got their opinions on that. Regardless, Calvin Ridley's market value is, I think, right around what the franchise tag is, which is about 21, 22 million. He's worth that as a player. And so even if you don't plan to keep him, the only way you're getting the third round compensatory pick is if you do not spend money in free agency. That is not an option. You have to spend a bit this year. So don't throw it in the trash, franchise tag him, and trade him in that scenario. Nevertheless, in this, and what I would do, is I would keep him on the franchise tag. It'd be simple. He will be better next year. You'll see if you want to pay him. You can make that decision later. And if you don't, well, do it again and trade him. You got to get something out of it. That's a normal thing that happens in the NFL. So I would have him back on the franchise tag. Very simple to me. The final one is Ezra Cleveland. Out of the guys you're bringing back there, free agents, Ezra did not have a great year here. However, I see him as a player that whatever environment he's in next year, he's probably getting a cheap deal. He's probably outperforming it. And he's probably getting a bigger deal after that. He's a good football player who came into a bad situation. He did not adjust to it properly. I mean, you think about the first game that he was here for was against San Francisco. That was the first game where things fell apart for this team. So I see him as a player who is better than what he did this last year. And I think you can take advantage of the situation You can pay him not really a whole ton, maybe like 4 million like we have here. And you go get him this next year and he starts and does well for you, and you get to decide next season if you want to keep him or not. He was a logical piece to bring in. He worked with Phil Rauscher before, and I think he's a player who could fill what's been a long-term need for the Jaguars at left guard. So I bring him back in this scenario, give him a shot. There's very low risk, high reward kind of situation, but after the year, you got to pay him what he's worth, whatever that may be. And it may not be paying him, it may just be letting him walk, even if he does earn a big contract, because hopefully next year he'd be earning that compensatory pick because he don't got to go out and sign a ton of free agents. Now, as far as the additions, I talked about positions that I felt like were major needs. Marcus Davenport is a logical guy for me to bring in, especially because of the hiring of Ryan Nielsen. Davenport, you want to guess when all his success came from? The specific years that Ryan Nielsen was in New Orleans with him as the DL coach in that system. So he's worked with him. He knows him. Davenport, after his fifth-year option, ended up taking a $13 million deal with Minnesota, got injured, wasn't able to prove it on that deal. And so now he's going to be significantly cheaper. I have him on a 2-year, $13 million deal. It's a second contract for him. It's not super long, but I don't think you give out a 3-year deal to a guy who just suffered, a huge injury and, in addition, did not perform up to the expectations because of that. So that's what I did with Marcus Davenport. I think it's a pretty cool fit, honestly, for trying to get the pass rush upgraded. I think it's a high reward kind of guy in your best scenario, and someone I'd feel pretty good about. Jair Alexander. I think you're taking advantage of a situation in Green Bay that's a little crazy that he's going, especially for where he was valued in the NFL before. I mean, I've seen cornerback rankings from before the last season where he's third in the NFL. This is a very good man-to-man coverage kind of corner. I think he can come in, perform at a high level. I think he's going to have something to prove. I think you can get him on an affordable deal, not having to pay him at the top of the market. In this scenario, I had it at $12 million. I'd be willing to work anywhere around there. It might be a little more. I don't know exactly where the value is, but I think you could get him somewhere around that. I would personally try to lock him up for a few years, because when I look at the injuries, sure, they've piled up a little bit here recently, but it's not like he's been out for an entire season. Like he hasn't missed like the whole 2022 season or 23. He's still playing a decent amount in the year. Worst case scenario, this is a guy like you just hope, hey, let's have him ready for the playoffs. Worst case scenario. And eventually you'd probably move on from that. But I think this is one where you get a massive reward for taking a chance on him. And there's not too much risk involved to where you're not comfortable with that. It's also a young player. He's technically 26 right now. He turns 27, I think, in February. So, young investment for the team. Will be his third contract technically. Doesn't matter, though. He's young. And then we got two more guys on the offensive side, that is. Kendrick Bourne, wide receiver from New England. He signed a $15 million deal over 3 years for the last 3 seasons with New England. He performed relatively fine. I think when you look at his individual performances in games, it's a lot better than the overall stats for the year, because this is the guy who's been injured quite a bit. That has been a problem, and that's something you're going to have to live with him. But you're paying him probably $4.5 million a year. You can live with that at that value. And this is someone that, similar to Jair Alexander, if he's healthy in the playoffs, that's a big impact on your team. I see him fitting in really well. I think that's also kind of clear because this was a player that Trent Baalke and Doug Pearson wanted to bring in back when they traded for Calvin Ridley. This was their other option. So they've had interest before. They see value in him. He would be a logical player to bring into this team. I have a 2-year deal for $9 million here. Nothing guaranteed in the second season, though. Maybe like $500K or something at most, but not really a whole lot. And then finally is Connor Williams. Because the final thing I feel like you absolutely have to hit no matter what is center. I know we could talk about like draft, uh, Cedric Van Pran or Jackson Powers Johnson or Graham Barden, Zach Frazier, like all these names. You do not know if you can do that. And you cannot go into the draft and miss on those opportunities and then have Luke Fortner starting again. Throw away the season if you do that. Unless you can trade for someone who's going to be good, which can't expect that either. They have to go sign someone in free agency. And Connor Williams is the obvious player. And the thing with him is that people talk about him having been injured a ton, all this stuff. Go look back at his seasons. He's had that recently, sure, like this last year he had a few injuries. But there's a lot of seasons where he's getting around 1,000 snaps on the year. And not only that, when he came to Miami from Dallas, he became a better player. He was incredible as a run blocker. You look at his PFF grades too, they're incredible. Really good. And so he would be a player that, even though he's suffered some injuries recently, he's still 27 years old. I would sign him to a 3-year deal. He's very young and he has a ton of upside. He's performed very well recently. I think you get your bang for your buck out of that. And centers, you don't got to worry about paying them ridiculous amounts. I think here we did $27 million over 3 years, $9 million average over seasons. I think that's a good deal for Jacksonville. So this is how I would apply that approach. Now, would this team with the draft included make a Super Bowl? I don't know. I don't think it would. I think that's a little unrealistic. It would be more in like a perfect scenario. But I don't think Jacksonville's really in a situation where they're going to be able to do that this next year. Because it's not only the roster we're talking about, but we're talking about dysfunction in the organization itself. I mean, we got a GM that just had one of the worst press conferences we've ever seen. In addition, if you guys don't look at Twitter at all, you might want to, because there's some funny stuff out there. He's got exposed for his burner account. We've already seen crap from him in the past, the stupid things he thinks. It's not good. There are problems in that organization, whether they admit it or not. Everyone knows it. I don't see that as a team that makes the Super Bowl, even with all this. Unfortunately, this is where we're stuck. They're not going to do what I want here. They're not going to do what any of us wants, unless, you pick the exact same players they do. So, this is all hypothetical, but we're still talking about what we think is best for this team. And this is where I would go with it. It'd be pretty simple to me. I should know, players that we didn't bring back. Trey Herndon, I think you need to upgrade in the slot at some point. Gregory Jr. will be your guy heading into the draft. I think that's okay, but you want to do better there. So ideally you get a corner. Dewan Smoot I had walk because he just didn't do as good off the Achilles tear, unfortunately. But that's the case. Maybe you bring back Angelo Blackson, like a practice squad deal or something. I don't think that's a huge deal in factoring this out. Chase on, just quite frankly, I don't know if he earned a spot on the team at bare minimum. So that's a problem. And that would be a reason to not bring him back. And then I think the last big notable player, because some of these could be guys that make the end of the roster, the back end that is. Jamal Agnew, I had walking. He had some big injuries this year. He was out a lot. He did have some big moments, but I think you can do a little better there. And I think the value for what you pay him isn't really worth it necessarily. It's debatable. But I wouldn't pay him what he's being paid right now, and I'm not going to project that he takes a big pay cut. So that's where we land with this. You guys, give me your thoughts on how you would build a roster, on what you would do. What do you think Jacksonville needs to do to become a contender? And you could throw in the obvious stuff like they need to fire everyone, because I agree with you on most of that. I think they need an EVP, someone to lead the football operations, someone who's proven doesn't have problems in the building, clearly coming into the organization like Balky did. I think they need to replace the GM. The assistant would be replaced in that case. And I think that those people need to be, hired by the EVP. Like, because I don't necessarily trust Doug Peterson in determining who gets brought in as the staff a whole ton. I mean, obviously we have Press Taylor, and then he wanted to bring in his buddy from the New York Jets as the DC. So I don't trust that a whole ton. That would be my thoughts on all that stuff. But this video was more so kind of talking about what can you do with who you have here and how I would approach that. But nevertheless, give me your thoughts. Give me your thoughts on what you would change from this as well, or just additions. I'd love to hear it. There's always more to learn. So that's all I've got. I appreciate your time. I'm going to go enjoy the rest of my vacation here. I'm recording this from Jacksonville. I don't live here, but I drove down, got here today, and enjoying my time. Going to go see some stuff sports related. Senior Bowl next week as well. So I'll hopefully have a video out or two for you guys on that. And then we'll also talk about some lessons learned from the 2023 season. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.